The deal. The man sat at a small, dimly lit table in a shady corner of the space station. His fingers drummed impatiently on the surface, the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. The space station, a giant, floating chunk of metal in the middle of the galaxy, was known for business deals. Dirty ones, the kind that took place behind closed doors. Deals that no one would talk about in the light of day. But for him, this was just another day. His name was Jonah, a man who had built his reputation on doing the things that others were too afraid to. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was just someone who did what needed to be done for the right price. And today, the right price was a small fortune, enough to change the course of his life forever. The deal he had been offered was like no other. A buyer, a wealthy and powerful merchant from a distant planet, had made it clear that he wanted two things: an alien and her daughter. The buyer had heard rumors of their existence and had paid a small army to capture them. Now, the alien mother and her child were being held in a high-security facility, and Jonah was the one who was supposed to make the final transaction. The terms of the deal were simple. Jonah was to take the alien and her daughter from their cell, hand them over to the buyer, and collect the payment. The merchant had promised him a hefty sum of credits, more than Jonah could have earned in a lifetime of honest work. It was a tempting offer. He had seen the suffering of the galaxy, the poor, the oppressed, and the helpless. But this deal was different. These weren't just any aliens. The rumors surrounding them spoke of a strange and powerful race, one that could control energy in ways that had never been seen before. Jonah didn't know what that meant exactly, but it was enough to make him nervous. Still, the money was hard to ignore. The credits would pay off his debts, buy him a new ship, and maybe even allow him to retire to a quiet corner of the galaxy. He had been living on the edge for too long. A deal like this could change everything. Jonah looked up at the man sitting across from him, the buyer's representative, a slick, well-dressed individual with cold eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. His name was Rook, and he was known in certain circles as someone who got things done. People who crossed Rook didn't live to tell the tale. Jonah had heard stories, but he had learned long ago to never fear someone's reputation. The only thing that mattered was the money. "Are you sure about this?" Jonah asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His heart was beating a little faster than usual. "These creatures, they're dangerous, right?" Rook's lips curled into a faint smile. "Dangerous? Maybe. But that's not your concern, Jonah. Your concern is delivering them, getting paid, and staying out of my way. I don't need you to worry about what happens after the transaction is made. You'll be rich, and that's all that matters." Jonah nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He had seen his fair share of strange creatures in his time, but the alien and her daughter weren't like anything he had ever encountered. Their species was said to be on the brink of extinction, having fled from a planet destroyed by war. They were survivors, and the mere thought of capturing them felt wrong. But he pushed those feelings aside. This was business, after all. He had to think like a professional. Rook slid a datapad across the table, the screen flashing with the details of the deal. "Everything you need is on there. You'll find the coordinates to the facility where they're being held. Just take them to the buyer, and we'll handle the rest." Jonah stared at the datapad, his finger hovering over the screen. He knew that once he took that first step, there would be no turning back. The money was tempting, yes, but something about the whole situation felt off. The aliens weren't just pieces of cargo. They were living beings. He had heard the whispers about their strange abilities, and he couldn't help but feel uneasy. What if they weren't just a simple mother and daughter? What if they were something more? The thought was unsettling, but Jonah had learned long ago to trust his instincts. In this line of work, instincts were often the difference between life and death. He hesitated, just for a moment, before nodding. He could walk away from the deal, but it would mean giving up everything he had worked for. And what would that make him? A failure. A coward. "No turning back," he muttered to himself. His decision was made. He would do the job. He had to. Rook's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. He stood up, offering a firm handshake. "Good. I knew I could count on you, Jonah. We'll be in touch." Jonah took Rook's hand, the coldness of the touch sending a chill down his spine. As Rook walked away, Jonah's thoughts turned darker. What had he just agreed to? The money would be incredible, but at what cost? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to make a terrible mistake. But the credits were already on his mind. And he knew that once he stepped onto that ship, there would be no turning back. The first encounter. Jonah stepped off the transport ship and into the cold, metallic halls of the holding facility. The air was thick with the smell of sterile chemicals and the faint hum of machinery. It was a place designed for containment, not comfort. Every corner seemed to echo with the silent whispers of captives, people and beings from all over the galaxy, held against their will. His boots clicked sharply on the floor as he moved through the corridor. He had been to places like this before: high-security prisons for criminals, labor camps, and slave markets. The grim reality of the galaxy wasn't new to him, but something about this place felt different. The walls were thicker here, the security tighter. Every step felt more dangerous than the last. Jonah's contact at the facility, a gruff man named Voss, led him through the darkened hallways, his face unreadable. They didn't speak much. Jonah wasn't here for small talk. His mind was focused, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He had made deals in the past, and he knew that walking into these places meant he had to keep his guard up. They finally reached the cell block. The cold steel doors, covered in layers of energy shields, stood like silent sentinels. Behind them, Jonah knew, were the alien and her daughter. He was supposed to deliver them to the buyer. And that was it. Simple, clean, and easy. But as Voss input the access code and the door slid open, Jonah's thoughts immediately shifted. The sight that greeted him was nothing like what he expected. The room was dimly lit, with two figures huddled in the far corner. One was an adult, tall, graceful, with striking, otherworldly features. Her skin shimmered like polished stone, with faint lines that seemed to pulse with an energy Jonah couldn't place. The other was a young girl, no older than 10, with wide, frightened eyes and trembling hands. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. The alien mother didn't look like the monster he had imagined. Instead, there was a deep sadness in her eyes, something that spoke of loss, fear, and desperation. The little girl clung to her, her tiny face pressed against her mother's chest, as if seeking protection from the world. Jonah was frozen. He had dealt with many beings: violent criminals, ruthless smugglers, and merciless soldiers. But he had never encountered anything like this. There was something unsettlingly familiar about their pain, something that made him feel like he wasn't just looking at captives. He was looking at people. The alien mother slowly lifted her gaze, locking eyes with Jonah. Her eyes were unlike anything he had ever seen, an intense, glowing hue, filled with intelligence and a strange depth that made his heart beat a little faster. It was as though she could see straight through him, through all his lies and facades. Her gaze was calm, but there was an undeniable plea in her expression, one that screamed without words. "You're the one who's going to sell us?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The words were surprisingly clear, though Jonah could hear the weight of an alien accent in them. The daughter remained silent, her wide eyes never leaving the floor. Jonah's stomach twisted. He had been expecting fear, defiance, maybe even anger from them. But there was none of that. Instead, there was only the quiet desperation of two beings who had been torn from everything they knew and were now at the mercy of someone who saw them as nothing more than property. He took a slow step forward, his mouth dry. He had to remind himself why he was here, why he had agreed to this. The money, the life he had always dreamed of. But in that moment, none of it felt real anymore. The alien mother's eyes were burning into him, and for the first time, Jonah wasn't sure if he could follow through with the deal. Voss was standing behind him, clearly impatient. "You've got your orders, Jonah. Get them moving. The buyer's expecting them." Jonah's gaze shifted to the floor, then back to the alien mother. Her steady, unreadable expression remained unchanged, but Jonah noticed her hand move slightly, reaching for her daughter. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, her lips trembling as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Jonah's heart ached for her, but he quickly suppressed it. He couldn't afford to care. This was just another transaction, a business deal. He had been in worse situations before, and he had come out on top. This would be no different, except it didn't feel that way. The alien mother finally spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "Please, help us." It was a simple plea, but it hit Jonah like a punch to the gut. He wasn't sure why, but it felt like something had shifted. He didn't know what had happened, but he knew that he wasn't just looking at a mother and her daughter anymore. He was looking at two survivors, trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. For a brief moment, Jonah's mind raced. He thought about the buyer, about the wealth that awaited him, the life he had always dreamed of. But then he looked back at the aliens, and something inside him twisted. Could he really do this? Could he go through with the deal? Voss was becoming impatient again. "Hurry up. You don't have time for this." Jonah glanced at the door, then at the alien mother. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. Everything in his life had led to this point, but suddenly, it didn't seem to matter anymore. Jonah couldn't help but wonder, what kind of man would he be if he handed them over? The inner struggle. The days following his first encounter with the alien mother and daughter were a blur for Jonah. He tried to focus on the deal. He tried to remind himself of the money, the power, the life he could have once the deal was done. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the alien's eyes staring back at him, eyes that seemed to search his soul, pulling out his deepest fears and desires. He tried to bury it, to push the guilt down into the darkest corners of his mind. After all, this was just business, wasn't it? He had made deals before, dirty ones, dangerous ones. But this felt different. These were not criminals or mercenaries. These were living beings, just like him, torn from everything they knew, and brought here like animals to be sold. Jonah paced the cramped quarters of his ship, his thoughts a tangled mess. The sounds of the engine humming softly in the background did nothing to calm his nerves. He couldn't stop thinking about the alien mother's voice, that soft, pleading tone. Her words echoed in his mind. "Please, help us." He had heard pleas like that before, from desperate refugees or individuals trapped in impossible situations. But this was different. He could see the fear in her eyes, not just for herself, but for her daughter. The little girl hadn't spoken much, but Jonah had seen the terror in her face. She was too young to be caught up in this war, this violence, this game of survival. Jonah sat down at the small desk in his quarters, trying to focus on the datapad in front of him. The buyer's contact information was still on the screen. The credits were already promised, already accounted for in his mind. His debts, his future, his dreams, everything hinged on this deal. Yet, despite all the reasoning, despite all the justifications he tried to make, something was gnawing at him from the inside. The image of the alien mother cradling her daughter flashed in his mind, and he felt his stomach churn. What kind of man would he be if he handed them over, if he sold them to the highest bidder? He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a soldier. But he wasn't a monster either. Was he? Jonah closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had been in the galaxy long enough to know that survival meant making tough choices, choices that would haunt you, choices that would cost you. The question was, how much was he willing to pay for his own survival? He rubbed his temples, trying to push away the guilt. This wasn't his problem. He wasn't the one who had destroyed their planet, wasn't the one who had forced them to flee. They were just another job, another transaction. He wasn't the hero of some story. He was just a man trying to get by. But then he thought about the power they were rumored to possess. The alien species wasn't just any race. They were said to have abilities beyond anything Joma had ever seen. Abilities to control energy, to bend it to their will. Some said they were the last of their kind. Survivors of a war-torn world, hunted and scattered across the galaxy. And if the buyer knew about those abilities, if he wanted to use them for his own gain, what would happen to the aliens then? Jonah's thoughts raced. He knew that the buyer was dangerous. If they sold the aliens to him, they would become nothing more than tools, objects to be used and discarded once they had outlived their usefulness. He had heard stories about this merchant. He didn't care about species or morals. He only cared about power and profit. The more Jonah thought about it, the clearer it became. The aliens weren't just part of a deal. They were victims in a much larger game, a game that Jonah didn't want to be part of. He had spent his life running from the consequences of his choices. But now, standing on the edge of this decision, he realized that there were some things even he couldn't walk away from. Jonah stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He stared out the window of his ship, the vastness of space stretching before him. The stars twinkled in the distance, silent witnesses to the decisions he was about to make. The universe was cold, indifferent to his struggles. It didn't care about his moral dilemma. The galaxy didn't care about one more soul lost in the chaos. But he cared, and that was the problem. The more he thought about the deal, the more disgusted he became with himself. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't a smuggler. Not really. He had crossed lines before, yes. He had done things he wasn't proud of. But he wasn't a man who sold others for profit. He didn't want to be that person. Jonah knew that if he went through with this, it would change him. He would never be the same. He would lose whatever shred of humanity he had left. And for what? Money. A better life. Was it worth losing himself? He thought of the alien mother again, her calm gaze, her plea for help. He thought of the little girl who had trusted him without even knowing who he was. They weren't just victims. They were people who had been dragged into something far beyond their control, and now it was Jonah's turn to decide their fate. Jonah's hand hovered over the datapad again. But this time, he didn't press the button. This time, he stood still, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. Not when he had the power to change their fate. The question now wasn't whether he could protect them. It was whether he could protect himself from the decision he was about to make. The turning point. The decision had been made. Jonah didn't know when it happened, but somewhere in the dead of night, when the stars outside his window blinked like distant, uncaring lights, the truth had finally broken through his defenses. The credits, the buyer, the promises of a better life, they all suddenly seemed hollow, empty. The guilt he had tried to ignore had grown into something unbearable, gnawing at him from the inside. The weight of the alien mother's plea, the silent desperation of her daughter, was no longer something he could shake off. Jonah stood at the helm of his ship, staring out into the vast expanse of space. He had always prided himself on being a pragmatist, someone who made choices based on logic, not emotion. But now, as he watched the cold, distant stars, he realized that this was the moment that would define him. This wasn't a job anymore. This wasn't about money. This was about doing the right thing. He reached for the comm system, his fingers hesitating over the controls. The buyer's message was still fresh in his mind. Sharp, demanding. You have the package. Get it to me. No delays. The tone had been cold, as if Jonah were nothing more than a delivery man, a cog in a machine that didn't care who or what got in the way. But Jonah wasn't that man. Not anymore. Jonah. He spun around, startled by the voice. Standing in the doorway was Voss, his expression as unreadable as always. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe suspicion. Jonah had always been good at reading people, but with Voss, it was never easy. The man was a walking wall, the kind of person who never let his guard down, even in the darkest moments. I thought you'd be prepping the cargo, Voss said, his voice low and measured. The buyer's getting impatient. Jonah didn't respond right away. He knew what Voss was talking about. The alien mother and daughter were still locked in the holding cells below deck, waiting for him to deliver them. The deal was simple. Too simple. But something inside Jonah had shifted. He couldn't go through with it. Not after everything he had seen, everything he had felt. "I'm not going to do it, Voss," Jonah said, his voice steady, but his insides were churning. The words felt strange, foreign on his tongue. He hadn't planned to say them, hadn't even known he was going to say them. But once the thought had formed, once the truth had cracked open in his mind, there was no taking it back. Voss raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the admission. "What do you mean, not going to do it?" He stepped forward, his tone hardening. "You've already signed up for this. You've already made your choice." Jonah shook his head, frustration and uncertainty building inside him. "I'm not going to hand them over, Voss. They're not just cargo. They're living beings. And I won't be part of this anymore." For a moment, there was silence between them. Voss stared at Jonah, as if weighing his words, trying to understand whether Jonah had finally lost his mind. "You've gone soft, haven't you?" Voss said with a sneer. "You're making a huge mistake." Jonah's fists clenched, but he held his ground. "It's not a mistake. It's the right thing to do." Voss laughed, a dark, bitter sound that echoed in the small space. "The right thing. You think the galaxy cares about the right thing. You think that alien and her daughter care about your conscience. They're just another set of merchandise. They don't care about you, Jonah." Jonah felt his pulse quicken. The anger inside him was rising, but he kept it in check. He couldn't let Voss bait him into a fight. "I don't care about the credits. I don't care about your deal. What's happening to them isn't right." Voss narrowed his eyes, his expression turning cold. "You're throwing away everything for them. You're making a decision that'll get you killed." Jonah's heart raced, but his resolve only strengthened. "Then I'll take that risk. I'd rather be dead than lose my humanity over this." For a long moment, Voss didn't say anything. The tension in the room was thick, heavy. Finally, he sighed and turned to walk away. "You're making a big mistake, Jonah. But I'm not going to stop you. Just remember, you're on your own now." As Voss disappeared down the hallway, Jonah stood still, his breath coming faster than usual. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. He knew Voss was right about one thing. He was making a dangerous decision. The buyer wouldn't take kindly to being betrayed. The consequences of his actions could be deadly. But for the first time in years, Jonah felt like he was doing something that mattered. Like he wasn't just drifting through life, making the same tired decisions again and again. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he'd make it out alive. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to sell the alien mother and her daughter. He was going to protect them. Jonah turned back to the controls, his fingers hovering over the comm system once more. This time, when he spoke, his voice was firm, unwavering. "I'm coming to get you," he whispered, though he knew the aliens couldn't hear him. "We're getting out of here." A bold decision. Jonah's heart raced as he paced the dimly lit cabin of his ship. The plan had begun to form, but the gravity of his decision was pressing down on him. The alien mother and daughter were still locked in the holding cells below deck, waiting for him to make his move. They had no idea what was coming next, but Jonah knew one thing for sure. He had to act quickly. If he was going to protect them, he had to get them out of here before it was too late. He had made the choice to defy the buyer, to go against everything he had known about survival in the galaxy. It was reckless, dangerous, and the consequences would be deadly. Jonah had no illusions about that, but he couldn't just stand by and let them be sold like livestock, sent off to some dark corner of the galaxy to be exploited for their power. He wouldn't be the man who handed them over. The ship hummed quietly around him, its engines purring with a kind of eerie calmness. Jonah could feel the weight of the situation pressing on his chest. He had never been one for grand gestures, for taking risks that could end his life. But something about this situation had changed him. Maybe it was the look in the alien mother's eyes, or the quiet desperation in the little girl's face. Whatever it was, Jonah was no longer the man who had agreed to sell them. He looked down at the datapad in his hand, the details of the buyer's transaction still displayed on the screen. It was too late to back up now. The buyer had already paid for the alien and her daughter, and he would be expecting delivery soon. If Jonah didn't show up with them, there would be hell to pay. But Jonah wasn't going to show up with them. He was going to do the unthinkable. He was going to steal them away, take them somewhere safe, somewhere the buyer couldn't find them. He had access to the ship's internal systems, and with a few quick keystrokes, he could disable the tracking devices. The buyer would never know where they had gone. The question was, where could he hide them? Where could he keep them safe without drawing attention? Jonah glanced over at the holding cells. He had spoken with the alien mother a few times since that first encounter, and she had made one thing clear. She didn't trust anyone, not even Jonah. She had seen too much of the galaxy's darkness, the cruelty of those who preyed on the weak. And yet there was a flicker of hope in her eyes when she looked at him. It was small, fragile, but it was there. She trusted him, just enough to believe that he wouldn't hand them over to the buyer. It was all he needed. Jonah grabbed the keys to the cells and made his way down the narrow corridor to the lower levels of the ship. The air grew colder as he descended, the lights flickering overhead. His mind was racing, but he kept his focus sharp. He couldn't afford any distractions, any slip-ups. The alien mother and daughter had to be freed, and they had to get out of here without anyone noticing. When he reached the cells, the alien mother was sitting against the wall, her eyes closed as if lost in thought. The little girl was standing by the window, staring out at the endless black of space. They both looked up when Jonah entered, the mother's eyes narrowing as if sizing him up. "We're leaving," Jonah said, his voice low but firm. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, the silent question in their eyes. They were waiting for confirmation, for something to prove that he wasn't just another liar in a long line of them. The alien mother stood up slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying an edge of disbelief. She wasn't sure if she could trust him yet, but she was willing to give him a chance. "I'm serious," Jonah said, his gaze locking with hers. "I'm not taking you to the buyer. I'm getting you out of here, somewhere safe." The little girl stepped closer, her eyes wide with hope. Jonah could see the flicker of relief in her face, but it was fleeting. She didn't fully believe him. Not yet. She had been let down too many times, but Jonah was determined to prove her wrong. He unlocked the door to their cell and stepped back, motioning for them to follow him. "Come on. We don't have much time." The alien mother hesitated for a moment, then nodded, taking the girl's hand. Together, they followed Jonah through the darkened corridors of the ship. He could feel the weight of their every step, the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing second. There was no turning back now. If they were caught, it would all be over. Jonah led them to the rear docking bay, where his ship's smaller escape pod was located. He had made sure everything was prepared ahead of time, just in case this moment came. The pod was small, but it would be enough for the three of them. As they approached the pod, Jonah turned to face the alien mother once more. "This isn't going to be easy," he said. "There's a chance we might be tracked, or that someone will come looking for us. But I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. You just need to trust me." The alien mother nodded, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something that told Jonah she was ready. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was willing to take the risk, for her daughter's sake, for her own. Jonah activated the pod's launch sequence, and the engines roared to life. The countdown began, and as the pod's hatch closed, sealing them inside, Jonah couldn't help but feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. This was the moment that would change everything. There was no turning back now. A risky escape. The escape pod hummed quietly in the dark vacuum of space, its sleek exterior cutting through the stars like a shadow. Jonah sat at the helm, hands gripping the controls, his pulse pounding in his ears. His heart raced faster than the pod itself as they sped away from the ship and the looming threat of the buyer. He couldn't help but glance back at the fading silhouette of his vessel in the distance. It felt surreal, like he was leaving behind everything he had ever known in search of something he couldn't even define yet. All that mattered now was keeping the alien mother and daughter safe. They were in the quiet of the pod's small cockpit, an eerie stillness that only deepened the tension. Jonah kept his eyes focused on the control panels in front of him, his mind racing with thoughts of the danger that awaited them. There was no clear path ahead, just uncertainty, and the knowledge that he had made an enemy of a powerful buyer who wouldn't let them go without a fight. The alien mother, seated in the small space behind Jonah, leaned forward, her glowing eyes sharp with awareness. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Her voice was steady but heavy with the weight of the question. It was clear she wasn't just asking about their current escape, but what it would cost them. Jonah exhaled slowly, fingers moving across the console as he adjusted their course. The escape pod was small, not equipped for long journeys, but it would be enough to get them through the first stretch. After that, they would have to figure out their next move. They'll come after us. They'll send everything they've got. This buyer is powerful. We got maybe a few hours before the first wave of ships tracks us down. The alien mother nodded, her face calm, but her eyes filled with the same concern Jonah was trying to suppress. He couldn't let her see how terrified he was. But truthfully, even with his best efforts to keep everything under control, he felt it. The sense that they were in the middle of something far bigger than just a smuggling job gone wrong. This wasn't just about dodging the buyer's forces. This was about survival. As the minutes ticked by, Jonah felt the pulse of their flight against his chest. The pod's engines hummed, a soft but constant reminder of the fragile escape they were trying to make. They were far from safe. The galaxy was vast, but it was filled with eyes that were always watching. It wasn't long before he began to notice a faint ripple on the scanners. Something, or rather, someone was getting closer. "Get ready," Jonah muttered under his breath. His fingers flew over the pod's controls, trying to shake off the feeling of being trapped. He knew this escape would only be temporary. The real challenge was ahead, but for the moment, all he could do was try to outsmart whoever was on their tail. The alien daughter, who had remained unusually quiet, turned to Jonah. Her wide, innocent eyes were full of unspoken questions. Her small hand reached up to tug at her mother's sleeve, and the alien mother lowered her gaze to the child. In that moment, Jonah could see how much they depended on each other. He had promised to protect them, but the weight of that promise felt heavier with each passing second. "Are we going to be okay?" The little girl asked softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. She was asking about more than just their immediate situation. She was asking if they could trust him to deliver on the promise he'd made. Jonah met her gaze in the rearview mirror, his expression steady. "We'll be okay. I won't let anyone hurt you." But even as he said the words, a chill ran down his spine. It wasn't that he didn't believe in his ability to fight back. It was that the stakes were far higher than he had anticipated. The buyer wasn't just some local merchant. He was an influential figure with resources, a network of mercenaries, and the kind of power that could tear apart anyone who stood in his way. They weren't just fleeing from a bad deal, they were running for their lives. A sudden beep from the console brought Jonah back to the present. He squinted at the screen, watching as a series of blips appeared in the distance. They were too far for a direct hit yet, but it was clear someone was tracking them. "Here they come," Jonah muttered. He slammed his hand down on the controls, pushing the pod into a sharp, evasive turn. The ship jolted as the engines strained under the pressure, but it held. For now. Jonah's fingers danced across the controls, locking in the evasive maneuvers he had used in countless scrapes before. He was good at this, outsmarting pursuers, keeping one step ahead. But this time felt different. This time, there was no room for error. In the rearview mirror, Jonah saw a shadow, a sleek, fast ship closing the distance between them. It was a hunter ship, the kind used by mercenaries who track down runaways and fugitives. Jonah knew these ships. He had used them himself in the past, though not in this context. The buyer had sent out his dogs to track them down. It was only a matter of time before they would start firing. The alien mother gripped the side of the cockpit, her eyes narrowing as she assessed their situation. "We need to get to an uncharted system," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Somewhere they won't be able to find us." Jonah nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. An uncharted system. A place so far off the grid that it wouldn't even show up on most galactic maps. It was risky, but it was their best shot. The trick was getting there without being caught. Jonah adjusted the ship's speed, pushing it to its limits. The hunter ship was closing in faster now, its engines roaring behind them. They were in a race against time. The dark void of space stretched ahead, silent and unforgiving. It was just them and the hunter ship. But Jonah wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when they were this close to freedom. He pushed the pod harder, the engines whining in protest as they surged forward. "Hold on tight," Jonah called over his shoulder, his voice low and determined. The alien mother, her face set with a grim resolve, nodded. She was ready. The little girl, though scared, clung to her mother's side. Jonah took a deep breath and aimed for the darkness ahead, hoping, praying that the unknown would be enough to hide them from the storm that was quickly catching up. The final stand. The space outside was vast and silent, a cold void that stretched on endlessly. But inside the escape pod, the air was thick with tension. Jonah's hands shook slightly on the controls as he pushed the ship to its limits, the engines screaming under the strain. The hunter ship was closing in, fast. He could see its silhouette now in the distance, a sleek predator that knew how to track its prey. The pod's tiny frame was no match for the firepower of the mercenaries in pursuit. They had no time to outrun them. Jonah knew that. He had already burned through their fuel reserves trying to make it to an uncharted system, but they were too far from safety. His heart raced as the blinking red lights of the hunter ship appeared in the cockpit display, signaling that they were in firing range. In the rearview mirror, Jonah saw the other ship's weapons charging. They were ready to fire. "We can't outrun them," Jonah muttered to himself. He knew this was the moment where he either made a stand or handed over the alien mother and daughter, losing everything he had fought for. The alien mother, who had been silent during their flight, stepped up behind him. Her eyes were no longer filled with the fear of someone trapped. Now they were focused, determined. "You have to stop them," she said, her voice strong despite the chaos of the situation. "If you don't, they will find us again. They won't stop until we're dead." Jonah met her gaze through the mirror. Her words stung, but they were true. He was no longer just a man on the run. He was their protector, whether he liked it or not. The stakes were clear now. If he didn't act, they would be caught. If they were caught, everything he had fought for would be lost. The ship jolted as the first round of fire from the hunter ship hit. Jonah gritted his teeth, his hands steadying on the controls. He had to make a choice, take the fight to them, or try to find another way out. But there was no time left to think. They were too close now. The alien mother had given him the strength to fight back. He couldn't let them down. The hunter ship came closer, its weapons charging for another shot. Jonah's mind raced. He had one shot at this, one chance to turn the tables. He activated the pod's emergency weapon systems, hidden deep within the ship's hull. The systems were old, untested, but they were better than nothing. He didn't have the luxury of relying on the pod's usual defenses. Jonah slammed the controls forward. The escape pod lurched as the weapons activated. Twin energy cannons flared to life, launching a barrage of rapid-fire blasts toward the pursuing ship. It wasn't enough to destroy the hunter ship, but it was enough to slow it down. The enemy ship veered off course, trying to avoid the shots. But Jonah followed their every move, adjusting the pod's trajectory with precision. Behind him, the alien mother and daughter braced themselves against the walls. Jonah could hear their breaths, steady yet strained. The alien mother's voice was calm as she said, "Do what you must. We are with you." Her words pushed Jonah to act with more determination. He pushed the pod into a sharp roll, narrowly dodging another barrage of incoming fire. The enemy ship's cannons fired again, but this time, Jonah was ready. He flipped a switch, activating the pod's cloaking system for a few precious moments. The ship disappeared into the darkness of space, its signature erased from sensors. For a moment, there was only silence. Jonah's heart was pounding in his ears as he scanned the area. The hunter ship had lost them, for now. But Jonah knew this wouldn't last long. The cloaking system wasn't powerful enough to keep them hidden for more than a few minutes. They would have to act fast. Jonah took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the stars. They needed to get to the uncharted system, the one place where they could hide. He had the coordinates programmed into the ship's system, but they were still too far to reach without risking another encounter. The alien mother spoke again, this time softer. "There is a planet nearby. It's not far, but it is forgotten by most, untouched by the greed of those who hunt us." Jonah turned to look at her, confusion furrowing his brow. "What do you mean?" She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "It is a world outside the maps of power and control. The buyer will not know of it. They will never find us there." Jonah hesitated. They were running out of options. He had never heard of such a place, but he trusted her instincts. If there was even a chance of safety, it was worth the risk. "I'll trust you," Jonah said, quickly adjusting the pod's course. The alien mother's eyes softened, her daughter looking up at him with a quiet sense of hope. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt like something Jonah would hold on to for the rest of his life. As the pod sped toward the coordinates the alien mother had given him, the tension remained thick in the air. Jonah couldn't stop thinking about the consequences of his decision. He had made an enemy of a powerful buyer, and the universe wasn't kind to those who crossed the wrong people. But for the first time, Jonah felt like he was doing something that mattered, something bigger than himself. The stars blurred outside the pod's windows as they plunged deeper into the unknown. Jonah kept his focus steady on the mission ahead. Protect them. Keep them safe. That was all that mattered now. And as the hunter ship continued its pursuit, Jonah steeled himself for the final confrontation. The buyer's forces wouldn't stop, but neither would he. This was his final stand, the moment where his past choices came to a head. And he would fight, no matter the cost, to make sure the alien mother and daughter got the chance at freedom they deserved. With the unknown planet in sight, Jonah knew one thing for sure. He wasn't running anymore. He was standing tall, ready to face whatever came next, with everything on the line.